Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening, and welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C.'s program with Dr. Anatol Lieven, author of Pakistan, A Hard Country. My name is Heidi Shoup. I'm president of the World Affairs Council, and it's my privilege to welcome you all here this evening. Dr. Lieven is currently a senior fellow at the New America Foundation and a professor in the War Studies Department at King's College London, where he is chair of International Relations and War Studies. He worked as a journalist in the 80s and 90s, reporting on revolutions in Czechoslovakia and Romania. And as a correspondent for The Times, he wrote on the former Soviet Union, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. In 1993, he won the George Orwell Prize for Political Writing and the Yale University Press Governor's Award for his book, The Baltic Revolution, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and the Path to Independence. He is the author of several other books, writes a monthly column for the Financial Times, and is featured in a number of other newspapers worldwide. While most Americans' focus on South Asia is drawn to the 10-year war in Afghanistan, our guest tonight argues that Pakistan is more important to the region. With its strategic location, large area, a population 6 times that of Afghanistan, and possessing one of Asia's strongest armies, he sees Pakistan as a viable and coherent state that works given the limits and standards of the region. Having interviewed hundreds of Pakistanis at every level of society, from villagers to soldiers and politicians, Dr. Lieven presents a profound and sophisticated analysis of Pakistan's history and its political, social, and religious structures. We look forward to his remarks, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Anatol Lieven.
Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Heidi, for that kind introduction, and thanks to the World Affairs Council for inviting me. I recently returned from a trip to Pakistan, so I'll talk about that this evening as well as about the book, sort of give my latest impressions of the situation. It must be said that my impressions of Pakistan have also differed over the years quite considerably from those of the media. On the other hand, I understand as a former journalist very well why the media gives the impression it does. A headline in the newspaper or on television which said, Pakistan, nothing much happened today, people went shopping, probably wouldn't get onto the front page very often. I actually, in recent years, considered taking my family on holiday to part of Pakistan. Only part, I hasten to add, not to the federally administered tribal areas and not to Peshawar. But it's true that I was deterred from that plan by fear. I mean, real, deep, deep fear of my mother-in-law, not of the Taliban. Unless you got very unlucky, you could visit Lahore with no serious threat. Or at least, I mean, by far the biggest threat, and of course that's true in the United States as well as Pakistan, would be not from terrorism, but from the way they drive. A much bigger danger. Pakistan is a troubled country. Bits of it are much more troubled than others. It is also, however, a huge country. It has almost 200 million people in it now. Second biggest Muslim country in the world after Indonesia, 6th biggest country, I think, altogether in the world. A country of that size can absorb a remarkable amount of damage, without collapsing. And what I argue very strongly in the book is that Pakistan is not a failed state or failing state. In certain respects, it's not even a fragile state, oddly enough. When I say this, I contrast Pakistan very deliberately with some failed states in which I have worked myself in the past as a journalist and researcher, like Afghanistan, Chechnya. Those are failed states. Pakistan is not at present. This was brought home to me very much during my last trip by a few days I spent in the district of Swat. Swat, some of you may remember, was an area that was actually effectively taken over by the Taliban in 2008 and early 2009 and used as a base for trying to take over neighbouring areas. I was there for the previous time, just after the army operation in 2009. I went back this time, and I must say I was very struck by the success of the army operation and also by the success of reconstruction. The success of reconstruction was particularly striking because in the interval last summer, Swat also suffered particularly badly from the floods which devastated Pakistan last August and September. Or rather, it didn't devastate Pakistan, the floods. This is another great example of the fact that you must read the Western media with care. Because the loss of livestock was very serious in Pakistan, yes. There was considerable damage to roads, although frankly in Pakistan you wouldn't always notice whether a road was damaged or not. They are, as you might say, congenitally damaged. The loss of life in a country that size was surprisingly small, only about 1,500 people. I mean, I say only, but you know, given the scale of the floods, it could have been much greater. Now, why was that? Well, the interesting reason was that the system actually worked. The barrages, the anti-flood barrages, put in place first by the British, and then by the Pakistanis, mostly in the 50s and 60s, held. They were not overwhelmed. The floodplains, which were left to absorb the overflow of the rivers in the case of floods, have, of course, as many people have said, been occupied illegally by local people. But those local people aren't damn fools. When they see floods on the way, they know where they live, they leave, they get out. The waters were directed into the floodplains, they were held by the barrages, the cities were therefore not flooded, the cities were not destroyed. As for the villages, they were, of course, quite often washed away, but to be brutally frank, mud huts are easy to rebuild. You know, this isn't like the destruction of, in the Pakistani countryside, of a sophisticated modern infrastructure. In addition, something that I dwell on very much in the book is the already existing and growing threat in future of water shortages as perhaps a greater threat to Pakistan in the long run than terrorism or extremism today. I stress in the long run. Well, I mean, the thing about the floods is that they, of course, actually replenished the water reserves of parts of the country. They replenished the Indus Delta, which has been drying up in recent decades. And partly in consequence, though also in consequence, of course, of the impact of China and India on international commodity prices, Pakistani agriculture today, despite the floods, is actually experiencing a boom, an export boom. And insofar as that is feeding into the various minor local industries and services which provide for agriculture, is helping to sustain the economy as a whole. I mean, the economy is doing badly, but it's not actually doing as badly as many people were predicting a couple of years ago, because agriculture is doing better. These are none of them, I think I'm right in saying, pictures that you would receive mostly from the Western media writing about Pakistan. They're not pictures my mother-in-law received, which is why if I took her daughter and grandson there, she would form an alliance with the Taliban and hunt me down, you see. So anyway, a most unusual alliance that would be, but effective, I fear. Now, the other thing about Pakistan is, it does remind me, in certain respects, of Russia, a country from which my father's ancestors were descended, and where I spent most of the 1990s as a journalist, and on aspects of which I've written several books. In that, I mean, Pakistan is much worse off than Russia in every way, but they do have this in common, that states that are, by Western standards at least, in varying degrees, incompetent, inefficient, corrupt, and so forth and so on, are still capable, when they really put their minds to it, of concentrating on and dealing with particular issues. And that is true above all in both cases, of course, and has always been true historically of Russia when it comes to the military. If it's a military issue, as long as, of course, they're not faced with overwhelming outside force, they can concentrate on it and solve it brutally, but they do. Now, this was brought home to me very much by this trip to Swat in March. The first thing striking, of course, is the improvement in the security situation. There have been no terrorist attacks in Swat now for more than 6 months. Striking in an area which, as I say, was previously one of the heartlands of militant support in Pakistan. This required a very large-scale army operation. And the Pakistanis have a point when they say that, you know, these operations take a large number of men. In the initial operation, they had to deploy 2 divisions. There's still a division and a bit up there in Swat. That's quite a lot for what is basically one long but narrow valley. The second thing is, of course, the brutality of the operation. Not very brutal by South Asian standards, but then that's not saying very much if you look at the history of Pakistani, Indian and Sri Lankan counterinsurgency operations. But certainly from my own interviews in Swat and from some direct testimony when I was there in 2009, I can endorse the picture drawn by Human Rights Watch in its report on Swat of extrajudicial executions by the army, which I was told are still going on at a rate of, well, some people said 1 or 2, some people said 5 or 6. Clearly the army isn't giving official figures, but they are going on. Now, I was told that most of the local population, not all, are prepared to accept these extrajudicial executions, partly encounter killings, as they're called in India and Pakistan, partly because the Taliban did make themselves quite widely hated in Swat by their brutality, but also because in a large majority of cases the army does at least get the right people. In other words, it's not hauling out completely innocent people in the middle of the night and shooting them in the back of the head. This reflects in turn the fact that they are, sorry, am I still not sufficiently, I'll try and lean forward a bit. Reflects the fact that the army is now getting accurate information from the population in Swat, which they certainly were not getting 2 or 3 years ago. Connected with their success has been a really quite impressive program of reconstruction, especially given the destruction caused by the floods. The areas that I visited were not nearly as badly damaged as I'd expected. For lower level Taliban, there are quite impressive programs of de-radicalization. And I mean, this isn't a euphemism for torture or murder or concentration camps. It genuinely is a de-radicalization process. And rehabilitation. There are also a range of projects going on to try to improve the local economy. One of them which was quite interesting because it's so completely contrary, I think, to, once again, the general image of the Pakistani military in the West. And I wouldn't say, by the way, that it's entirely characteristic of the military either, at least, at the very least, only one part of the military, was that I visited a vocational training centre for women, which the army had set up together with an NGO in Mata, which was one of the main centres of militant support and of fighting in Swat in the past. And they were training these local women in handicrafts, embroidery, sewing and so forth, to make some income from their families, plug them into the market economy, help in de-radicalization. A soldier quoted to me, "Well, I don't know its origins. It might be it sounds like something the Jesuits would have said, but you hear it often from the Islamists too, that if you convert a man, you convert only a man. If you convert a woman, you convert a whole family." So they were trying to win, you know, these women over. What was most interesting, though, was the inspirational photographs that they put on the walls to inspire these women to, you know, who came, as I say, from what had been a very radical area, to turn against militancy. They were pictures of women military cadets and officers in the Pakistani army, including, there are now 5, I believe, women pilots in the Pakistan Air Force. And the biggest photograph covering a whole wall was of one of these women pilots getting into the cockpit of her plane with her helmet and goggles. And so God knows what effect this had on the local women in this village, who are a considerable distance in terms of education and prospects from becoming fighter pilots in the Air Force. But it does indicate what a strange beast in many ways the Pakistani military is. And perhaps all militaries are strange beasts, at least not non-military people. But it is a curious animal. Quite, conservative Muslim in certain respects, dedicated to a certain vision of progress in other respects, above all, of course, as you would expect from any military, nationalist, dedicated first, foremost, and all the time to the strength of Pakistan. Because you often hear at meetings and conversations, what game are the Pakistani military playing? Why are they doing what they're doing? What interest are they reflecting? Well, the answer is Pakistani interest, as they see it, admittedly, because of course they're also absolutely convinced that the interests of Pakistan are defined by them and nobody else. It's also true that, of course, their view of Pakistani interests is deeply shaped by a fear of India that doesn't just verge often on paranoia, it dives in head first and wallows in paranoia. Paranoia is also an occupational hazard of security people, I've noticed, but anyway, perhaps a little more so in this case. So the military operation there really has been successful, admittedly in a limited area. But a Pakistani Taliban movement, which back in 2008, 2009 was widely portrayed, and of course in the Pakistani media as well as the Western media, as an almost unstoppable force moving from area to area, sweeping away the local administration and police, which by the way was true in certain areas, that has been stopped and rolled back. Which is good for everybody on a large scale, and it's good for me on a small scale, because I said that was the case in my book, and it's been vindicated for the moment. On the other hand, what SWAT also brings out is that so many of the underlying factors which motivated people to sympathise with or to join or to support the Taliban have not been solved. And of these, the most important are the following, in no particular order. The first is the failure of the Pakistani state to provide good governance and, above all, justice to people in Pakistan. This is particularly acute in this resentment of this is particularly acute in Swat, because until 1969, Swat was an autonomous princely state, as it had been under the British, ruled by the Wali of Swat, descended from the Akhund of Swat, about whom there's a famous poem by Edward Lear, you may know. Anyway, the overwhelming consensus, including among Pakistani military officers and even Pakistani officials, is that Swat was much better ruled under the princes than it has been by Pakistan, which is a sad comment, to put it mildly. One particular aspect, or particularly bad aspect, is justice. The Pakistani state judicial system is a shambles of corruption, delay, incompetence, which simply denies the possibility of justice to most ordinary people, or at least justice at any kind of cost they can possibly afford. The Taliban has made tremendous play, or at least initially it was able to, with the promise of bringing Sharia law. Now, Sharia law in this context, it needs unpicking what the real message was. As far as ordinary people in these areas are concerned, this isn't what we think of, or indeed as the Sharia is in itself, a very rigid, codified system of laws, inflexible, detailed. On the contrary, as preached now by the Taliban in Pakistan and Afghanistan, it is a synthesis of the Sharia with the local tribal tradition or code called Pashtunwali. Many of the punishments, the decisions being made, have nothing to do with Sharia law. They are in fact from the Pashtunwali, but they are justified in the name of the Sharia. As far as local people are concerned, the appeal of this is twofold. One is, well, it is after all the word of God, the Sharia. But much more important, it is a kind of code for a system of justice which will be quicker, more accessible, more popular, more honest, and conducted in a language which local people understand, not in English in a town 200 miles away. Rough justice, perhaps, but better, unfortunately, than that being offered by the Pakistani state. So that's one thing. Connected with this is the social appeal of the Taliban, because especially in Swat, but to a considerable extent elsewhere as well, if you talk to ordinary people, you get a very strong sense of how the Taliban are trying to mobilize the poor against the rich. Now, that doesn't make them, of course, a formal revolutionary movement. This is an emotional appeal rather than a program, say, of land reform. But ordinary people, former Taliban detainees I talked to, all stress this, that the Taliban were preaching social justice. They were saying that they would punish and drive out landowners and landowner politicians who had oppressed the poor. They carried out some high-level symbolic punishments of particular people, and they got a large part of the poor on their side in consequence. One reason why this feeling was particularly strong in Swat was, once again, because whether in reality or myth, the story by ordinary people, not just ordinary people actually, educated people as well in Swat, was that the old prince, the Wali, kept the local landowners in check and prevented them from oppressing the poor. Part, no doubt, I mean, chiefly for his own reasons, because he saw the landowning class, the Khans, as a threat to him. But anyway, he did keep them in check. Whereas under Pakistan, they've been allowed to run riot, unchecked, depriving poor people of their land, in the worst case, raping, murdering, and so forth. So, a second very important factor. The third factor is the combination, in very interesting and complicated ways, of sympathy for the jihad in Afghanistan with Pashtun ethnic sentiment. The way in which the forces that later became the Pakistani Taliban initially really succeeded in rallying local support was by portraying themselves, and not just portraying themselves, actually acting in reality, as a force not for revolution in Pakistan, not for overthrowing the Pakistani state, but as allies of the Afghan Taliban. Now, the point about this is that, thank God, even in the Pashtun areas of Pakistan, outside particular areas at particular times, and it's difficult to put a figure on it, of course, a large majority of the population does not support revolution against Pakistan, does not support the overthrow of the existing Pakistani state, if only because Muslims in Pakistan are deeply divided, according to sect, Muslim sect, but also, of course, according to ethnicity and province and so forth. So Pakistan is not, in my view, a place that can generate a united revolutionary movement. Any revolutionary movement in one area is likely to find countervailing process in the other. But I must tell you, and I say this with deep regret, that when it comes to the Afghan Taliban and their jihad against America, Britain, sympathy for them and for their cause in Afghanistan, not in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in the Pakistani population is absolutely overwhelming, to judge by my interviews on the ground in every area of Pakistan, except FATA, as you can see from the fact that my head and shoulders are still in one piece rather than two, but all the other provinces, main cities and so forth. As I say, I take no pleasure in saying this, but the Pakistani population sees the Afghan Taliban in very much the same light they saw the Afghan Mujahideen in the 1980s when I was there. In other words, not as nice people in themselves, but as a legitimate resistance force against foreign occupation of their country. And the association with that popular jihad was what also helped to give the Pakistani Taliban much of their initial impetus, and still does, against what is, of course, not just portrayed, but seen by a large part of the population as a government of Pakistan which is shamefully subservient to orders from the United States. Connected with this, but not in overt ways, is the issue of Pashtun nationalism, the idea that the Afghan Taliban are defending the Pashtuns of Afghanistan against their ethnic enemies, the Tajiks, the Hazaras, and others. Now, the Taliban does not present itself as a Pashtun nationalist force. It never has. These words do not appear in its propaganda. They come out more by particular cultural tropes, phrases, summed up perhaps best of all in something that was said to be not by a Taliban sympathizer, on the contrary, by a bitter opponent of the Taliban, the son of a senior politician in the Awami National Party, which is the sort of moderate nationalist party which currently heads the government of what used to be the Northwest Frontier Province, is now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in Pakistan. And he said, you know, a key part of the problem is, when it comes to combating the Taliban, that every Pashtun has been brought up from his cradle, and her cradle too, by the way, to believe that fighting against foreign infidel occupation is part of what it is to do Pashtu, which means to follow the Pashtun way. You see, brought up on the legends of fighting the British for 100 years, brought up on the legends of fighting the Russians. And that is something which appeals to secular Pashtuns, or at least non-Islamist radical Pashtuns, as well as to the ideological supporters of the Taliban. And it was largely for this reason that the ANP came to power, ran in the elections of 2008 on a platform of negotiation with the Pakistani Taliban, negotiation and compromise. In February of 2009 actually did reach an agreement with the Taliban in Swat, the Nizami Adl Agreement, which instituted the Sharia as the legal system of Swat, because the bulk of the ANP's voters and activists hated the idea of Pashtuns fighting each other on what they saw as the orders of the United States. Now, the Taliban then, thank God, as I've said once already today, our best assets in many ways in this struggle are our enemies and their behaviour. Because the funny thing is that the Taliban in Swat seem to have fallen for the same line as the Western and Pakistani liberal media. They thought they were winning, they thought the Pakistani state was collapsing, and they thought they really could come out of Swat and overrun, you know, more and more districts. And indeed they did, one in Bunair. But then the army hit back with the support of the main political parties, or at least of the government in Islamabad and the government in Peshawar, and did so successfully, and has driven them back into Fatah, back into the mountains, and to a great extent contained them there. That say, it's contained the insurgency. We must always keep in mind, well, not just in Pakistan, anywhere else, the difference between insurgency and terrorism. On the one hand, I mean, insurgency can be contained if the state is strong enough. It's much more difficult to contain terrorism, and you know, terrorism is now a threat across most of Pakistan. On the other hand, when it comes to the resilience of the Pakistani state, it's worth remembering, I think, that as far as I know, perhaps somebody can think of an example, no state has ever been overthrown by terrorism. On the contrary, terrorism can actually strengthen states in some respects, because it gives them the excuse to be more repressive, and it can also, of course, so horrify and terrify ordinary people that they throw their weight behind the state. That's why, of course, states sometimes carry out terrorism themselves by way of a provocation. You want to overthrow a state, you need one of three things, or some combination of them. A revolution on the streets of the cities, as we've seen in the Middle East in recent months, masses of people coming out and simply overwhelming the state forces, often combined with a mutiny in the army, or at least a refusal of the army to fire, as we saw in Petrograd in 1917, but in effect, as we've seen sometimes in recent months in the Middle East as well, or an insurgency in the countryside, which sweeps from one area to another, like Mao, the communists in China, until finally they overthrow the state and take over. Now, none of these things are happening yet in Pakistan. And in my view, the deep divisions of the country, but also the rooted power of the Pakistani elites in many areas, rooted in kinship as well as property, or perhaps principally in kinship, mean that in most circumstances a revolution will not occur unless some outside power smashes the Pakistani state, or not smashes it, but splits it. Now that could be India, but for India to smash the Pakistani state would require a full-scale war involving nuclear weapons, in my view. If only because if India was about to do that, Pakistan would use nuclear weapons, and then we'd be in apocalypse territory. But any Indian threat short of that in many ways unites Pakistanis rather than divides them. The power which could destroy Pakistan is, ironically enough, the United States, actually. And one of the things I say in my book is that my book, amongst other things, is a very strong argument that as long as Pakistan continues to cooperate in one key respect with the US and the West, America in no circumstances should do this. That key respect is cooperating against terrorism directed at the United States and the West. Remember, we are not supposed to be in Afghanistan. That's not what our peoples have been told. It's not what our soldiers have been told. For the sake of maintaining the prestige of the British or American militaries. We're not supposed to be there for the sake of simply propping up the Afghan government, whatever it is. The whole point of being there is supposed to be to prevent terrorism against us, against the citizens of our countries at home. Now here, Pakistan is playing a very ambiguous role. Or rather, it's playing a very positive role on the whole when it comes to preventing terrorism against the West. Western intelligence agencies agree Pakistan's cooperation has been valuable, sometimes extremely valuable, and continues to be so. The problem, of course, on the other hand, is Afghanistan. There, Pakistan's cooperation has been weak to non-existent, and in my view, is not going to get any better in future. Because of a mixture of the popular sympathy with the Afghan Taliban that I've mentioned and the strategic calculations of the Pakistani military, which are all about maintaining some kind of allies in Afghanistan against the threat of Indian influence and Indian hegemony. So on the one hand, you have Pakistan cooperating in one key area, not cooperating in another area. In the middle, you have those terrorist groups which are not Pashtun-based and did not come directly out of sympathy with the Afghan Taliban, but either originated in sectarian hatred within Pakistan itself, notably the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, which was an anti-Shia terrorist force, but which has now joined the Taliban and moved into rebellion, but much more formidably as a potential international terrorist threat, the anti-Indian jihadi groups, because of course they were trained and equipped by the Pakistani military to fight against the Indians, and trained very well, as we saw in Mumbai a couple of years ago. And the consensus among intelligence analysts that I've talked to is that Lashkar-e-Taiba, in particular, is the best, worst, anyway, the most potentially effective terrorist group which is out there. Now, Lashkar-e-Taiba, however, is not attacking the West. It hasn't attacked India since Mumbai, although clearly that is still on the agenda, potentially. What appears to have happened is that the Pakistani army has told them the following. One, the key deal is, you don't join the rebellion against Pakistan, we do not crack down on you, as India and America have been demanding. Two, don't attack India for the moment. In future, who knows? The day will come. But at the moment, you can't attack India because look at Mumbai. It brought in the threat of American retaliation. By the same token, but much, much more categorically, you must not launch or allow any of your people to launch terrorism against the West. against Western countries in general, but America in particular, because if that happened, I mean, it would be bad enough if any terrorist group succeeded in launching an attack on America, even somebody like Faiz al-Shehzad, you know, who was linked to the rebels against Pakistan. But if a terrorist group linked to the Pakistani military launched a successful terrorist attack on America, God help Pakistan. And they know that. So, no attacks on the United States. But Afghanistan? Sure, go ahead. You know, your boys have joined to fight. We know they have to fight somewhere. They started fighting in Afghanistan against the Soviets in the 1980s. Go ahead. We can't stop you. And by the way, we don't particularly want to either. So, you have this dilemma. Useful in one key respect, worse than useless in another one. How do you square the circle? Well, for me, I must say, on the basis of both what I know of Afghanistan on the ground, from travels both with the Mujahideen in the 80s and after 9/11, and from what I've observed of Afghanistan in recent years, I believe that it may be possible for us to imitate Soviet strategy and leave behind an Afghan national army that will hold the main cities against the Taliban, thereby sparing us the humiliation of defeat. That, however, is a recipe for unending civil war in Afghanistan, accompanied by Afghan Taliban links to al-Qaeda and its allies, because they are very useful to them in a context of continuing war. I do not believe, looking at the Karzai administration and the whole history of the past 10 years, actually not the history of the past 10 years, the history of the past 35 years almost, that there is any chance of extending serious governance from Kabul to the Pashtun countryside. In these circumstances, my own view is that it would be better to explore, not saying it would work, but to explore the possibility of a settlement with the Afghan Taliban, in which they would essentially take control of most of the Pashtun areas. Clearly, the terms of this would have to be the exclusion of al-Qaeda, and also, by the way, do what the Taliban did in 2000 and suppress the heroin trade, which is not so much of a threat to America, but a terrible threat to Britain, to Russia, to other European countries. If the United States were to go for this strategy, Pakistan, well, it's still a problem in certain respects, but if it comes to negotiations with the Taliban, Pakistan becomes an asset, because Pakistan is the country which can mediate with the Taliban, and is also the only country in a position to put enough pressure on them to get them to accept some kind of a deal. It will always be a deal partly on their terms, but some kind of a deal. The other reason why I would advocate this is that, as Heidi said in her introductory remarks, to say that Pakistan is more important than Afghanistan is a matter not of sentiment but of mathematics. In terms of size, its army, leave aside the question of nuclear weapons. If the Pakistani army disintegrated, the terrorist threat to the West would increase by several orders of magnitude in terms of weaponry, expertise, all these things. And above all, though this is something which it affects America indirectly, it affects Britain and Canada directly, but therefore America at only one remove, because of course of the large and in part potentially radicalized Pakistani diasporas in the West, who are citizens, they can travel. And they are very closely linked to their home communities. The British population of Bradford in particular is deeply committed to the struggle in Kashmir. Why? Because they're Kashmiris from Mirpur. They're still closely connected. Therefore, it seems to me it would in the end be a lunatic bargain to risk sacrificing the stability or even the existence of Pakistan for the sake of a victory in Afghanistan, which seems to me more and more illusory. Thank you.
Talk about Kashmir, on which I think everybody, if they could solve that, then that would sort of, but that sort of sounds like that game is going to go on forever. But there were some attempts, I think, alleged attempts at the end of the Musharraf period.
Yeah.
And then now there's been supposedly some contact. Is there some hope? And because that, I think, would, or other people seem to think that would make things a lot easier in the whole neighborhood.
There is some hope. I mean, there is a realization among more intelligent or pragmatic elements in the Pakistani military that, I mean, quite clearly, they've tried several different strategies to quote unquote liberate Kashmir, and quite obviously none of them have worked. In addition, the Indian economy is growing so much faster than the Pakistani that they are becoming, leaving aside, of course, the crucial issue of their nuclear deterrent, which is why they have it. Conventionally, they're getting into a more and more hopeless situation vis-à-vis the Indians. The problems are twofold. Musharraf suggested informally a solution along Northern Irish lines. In other words, leave the existing frontier in place, but soften it with trade, human contacts, cross-border institutions, and so forth. But he never actually brought himself to the point of a formal offer. Nor, it must be said, however, in those years did India respond nearly adequately. By the time India did begin to respond, Musharraf was so weak internally that no deal was possible. Today, the Zardari government is very weak. The position of the Pakistani army is ambiguous. But also, it's not that the Indians are coming forward with proposals, either formal or informal. It seems that Manmohan Singh, the Indian Prime Minister, would like to, but he is apparently very isolated within his own party on that, and there is strong opposition within India. Apart from anything else, of course, the Indians are getting so much stronger that many of them see absolutely no need to compromise at all on the issue. That, in my view, is a serious mistake, because that would only make sense if at the same time you were prepared to shrug off terrorism on the issue, which India, however, is not. It also ignores the fact that the recent unrest in Kashmir, as indeed the unrest in the late 1980s, which set off that terrible round of violence that occurred, was indigenous to Kashmir. It was not provoked by the Pakistanis initially. It was indigenous resentment. So, I mean, there is a strong case, but I'm not optimistic. I am actually somewhat more optimistic that India and Pakistan could reach a form of détente over Afghanistan, simply because, once again, I mean, the intelligent and pragmatic people on both sides, of whom, you know, there are some, I think can now see quite clearly that neither of them is going to get their maximal aims in Afghanistan. They're going to get something well short of that. If they're prepared to accept something well short of that, well, maybe there is the grounds for a settlement.
My question is funding. These people, how you describe them, they don't have jobs. Where are they getting the funding? Who is supplying the money? Because nothing happens without money. You mentioned the heroin. What other source, and how does it, you know, heroin just doesn't grow and get out to the market. What is the process, if that's the funding, and who's supporting it?
Funding for the Taliban.
Yes.
Yeah, it's
Afghan and
yes,
Pakistan.
it's heroin partly. It's partly money from the Gulf, private money, not from states, private money. And it may be, although that's not certain, in part the Pakistani state. Something to remember, however, is that the money involved is not enormous. It's a few tens of millions of dollars, you know, each year. I mean, there is an absolutely incredible disproportion between the amount of money that we are spending on the military effort in Afghanistan and our enemies are spending. As to how the heroin gets out, well, it gets out partly via the Taliban and their allies, particularly Baluch smugglers. And of course, but it gets out mostly, in the end, via our allies in the Karzai administration and local warlords. But the point is, you see, that the Taliban taxes it as well. This is something I remember vividly from traveling with the Mujahideen in the 1980s. You would be passing with with whatever Mujahideen group you were with, very, very close to an Afghan government post. And you'd be getting a bit nervous, or at least I would be getting a bit nervous, saying, oh, hang on, we're in plain sight here. You know, aren't they going to shoot us? No, there's a truce. There's a truce. And I'd ask, why is there a truce? And the reply essentially would be, well, it's all around you. What was all around you? Opium poppies. There was a truce between the government forces and the Mujahideen so that they could get in the opium harvest and ship it out, and they could both profit from it. The Soviets, it seems, actually brokered a good many of these deals so as to neutralize local Mujahideen forces. As far as I can see, to a considerable extent, it's the same today. You have local deals between people on our side and people on the Taliban side so that they can share the heroin.
Regarding whether there is or not radicalization of mainstream Pakistani society. And the reason I ask that is I read an article not so long ago about, I think, a law that exists in Pakistan that puts under, makes it illegal to use blasphemy.
Mm-hmm.
It has been, I think, lately there are efforts to repeal this law, and then people who are in favor of repealing this law have been assassinated. Among them, I think, the governor of one of the provinces.
Yeah, well, two people have been assassinated.
Okay. And young lawyers were portrayed in some media as cherishing the assassins. If you could comment on that part.
Yeah. Well, there is a measure of radicalization in Pakistani society, yes. Related to the social issues I talked about, related to urbanization as well. But the blasphemy law is an old law in Pakistan. And blasphemy as an issue was getting people killed under the British 100 years ago. The assassin of Salman Taseer, the governor, came from what has been portrayed as a moderate form of Islam, the Barelvis in Pakistan. They're not exactly moderate. What they are is opposed to political Islamism reflecting rival theological traditions. This is, I mean, very crudely simplified, a kind of Catholic-Protestant split, but with the bitterness of the 17th century rather than, of today. So, look, I mean, I'm not saying that Pakistan is progressing far or fast. It isn't. The same forces which in many ways maintain the stability of Pakistan and are opposed to revolution are also forces for stagnation, conservatism, of course corruption, plundering the state, obstructing revenue, and all these things. But the degree to which the population as a whole is becoming radicalized, in my view, can be exaggerated.
Hi, my name is Ahmad Khan. My question is about the role of Pakistani army in Pakistan's foreign policy. I think there's no secret that a lot of decision making now happens in the GHQ. So, what do you think is the exact role of Pakistani army in the politics, and how detrimental is that to the democracy in Pakistan? And my second question is about the terrorist attacks in Pakistan. And what I was trying to understand was why there's still so much sympathy among the Pakistani public for these terrorist organizations.
Well, on the second point, the Pakistani public, as I'm sure you know yourself, is in a state of complete intellectual muddle on the subject. There is a very widespread belief that, because, I mean, at bottom, they don't want to believe that Muslim Pakistanis are doing this kind of thing, I mean, it's understandable, but mad. In addition, however, there are two other factors. There is, an underlying conspiracy-mindedness, which has applied to just about everything, but of course applied particularly now to the United States and Israel, which has been enormous. I mean, it was always there. It's been enormously boosted by the invasion of Iraq, I'm sorry to say, which simply allowed the extremists in Pakistan to tell the population, and the population to agree that the war in terror is simply an excuse for America to invade and conquer Muslim countries in order to dominate the Muslim world on the orders of Israel. I'm sorry to say that, but that is what is believed. I'm not saying it's true, but that is what is believed on the street. I'm sure you'll agree, in Pakistan, not just on the street, in the educated classes as well. Then there is the ingrained tendency to blame India for everything, and I mean everything, encouraged in recent years by a specific strategy of the US military, which is to motivate the soldiers to fight, which they initially, of course, really didn't want to do against the Pakistani Taliban, by telling them that the Pakistani Taliban are really Indians, or that India is backing them. Mad, lunatic. But you see, why are they saying this? The reason is it works. The soldiers believe it. And since they're completely conditioned, to fight against India as the enemy, well, so all of, so as a result, conversations with ordinary people go something like this, should the army and the state fight against the Pakistani Taliban, or should they, try to make peace with them? Well, they should try to make peace with them. Well, but, should one really make peace with a force which is killing, carrying out terrorism against fellow Muslims? I have to say, I don't even usually raise the question of carrying out terrorism against us, because, well, anyway. But they're not, you see. It's only the bad Taliban who are doing that. The Indian Taliban, the good Taliban are not doing that. They're not killing fellow Muslims. Well, who are the good Taliban and who are the bad Taliban? Oh, we don't have the information on that. We couldn't say. There is a... Sorry, Naval has heard this before many times, but it's completely true. There is a small dent in a wall in Karachi where I was actually literally reduced to banging my head against it on one occasion when faced with this kind of thing. On the role of the military, yes, the military, as I said, believes that in the end, Pakistan's security interests are decided by it, the Pakistani military. It is, of course, encouraged in this, it must be said, by the, the failings of the Pakistani politicians and political parties that we all know about. Certainly when it comes to Afghan policy and policy towards India and policy and strategy against terrorism, the army has, in effect, a veto, ultimately, of what happens. On the other hand, the army is no longer, admittedly, after intense pressure from us, actually conducting a jihad against India, for the moment at least. And most of the soldiers I've talked to have genuinely accepted that Pakistan will not get most of what it wants in Afghanistan. It will get some of what that aiming at Taliban rule over the whole of Afghanistan, subservient to Pakistan, is over. That's never going to happen. Because after all, it didn't happen actually even in the 1990s. The Taliban turned around and kicked them very badly, after Pakistan had done so much to support them. So, as to how much the Pakistani military have damaged democracy, well, when it comes to, leave aside democracy, because I do have to say, Pakistani democracy generally is quite capable of damaging itself without too much help from anybody else. But as far as damaging the state and development is concerned, you could actually work that out mathematically, although I'm too tired to do so. But on the one hand, there is the disproportionate share of the budget which is swallowed up by the military. Then, however, how long is a piece of string? What is disproportionate? But still, you could make international comparisons and simply look at this burden on the budget of military spending. But then, of course, you would have to set this in the balance against the fact that Pakistan has the lowest rates of tax collection in South Asia. 9.7%, I think, to 13% in Sri Lanka and 17% in India. Now, that's not the fault of the military. That is the fault of the politicians and the local elites who, of course, use a mixture of corrupting the tax authorities and blocking taxes in Parliament to prevent taxes being raised. And that, more than the military budget, by very significantly more than the military budget, of course, deprives the Pakistani state of what it needs for education, health, social welfare, infrastructure development, etc.
I was wondering if you had a chance, in your interlocutions with Pakistani military officials, any talks as to some of the criticism that the Pakistani army has taken with regards to human rights abuses in the SWAT area? Particularly last year, there was a case of 6 or 7 young men in the SWAT Valley who were executed by a group of Pakistani soldiers. I was wondering, what kinds of reads did you get from them with regards to all criticism, and especially in relation to just some of the acts of Congress recently, with regards to Senator Jim Webb, who recently issued a letter back in February saying that he wants to renew an amendment that he passed back in 2009, which basically stated that in addition to not only cutting off assistance to Pakistan if they continue to develop a nuclear weapons program, but also there might have been an additional proviso regarding human rights.
Mm. Well, the answer is officially, of course, they deny all this, as they are bound to categorically. In private, some of them admit this is happening. They generally say it's not happening on the scale that human rights is what has been saying, but above all, they say we're getting the right people. Incidentally, I mean, I have to say that the title of the book, A Hard Country, the last time I heard this phrase was from a police officer in southern Punjab who was explaining why, given the weakness of the police and the cowardice, as he frankly admitted, but also the corruption and the cowardice of the courts and the sympathy for the terrorists, that if you wanted to send any kind of serious message to terrorists in southern Punjab, the only way to do it was to take some of the nastiest ones into a field in the middle of the night and shoot them in the back of the head, what's called in South Asia encounter killings. So, in private, this is acknowledged but justified. But I mean, it's also, of course, the argument is, but of course it's not happening on nearly the scale that HRW says and so forth and so on. As far as American criticism on this point is concerned, it causes utter fury from 2 points of view. One is, well, not just two, many points of view. The first is basically the underlying feeling that we're only in this mess because you forced us into it. Secondly, how dare you say this to us? Your allies in Afghanistan, when they captured Taliban prisoners in the autumn of 2001, put them in metal containers in the middle of the desert and baked them to death. Have you brought them to trial? Thirdly, well, all the things, what about waterboarding, what about, Guantanamo, what about rendition, and so forth and so on. And then finally, of course, there's drone strikes. I mean, at least we get the right people, they say. You go after with, drones, and for every Taliban commander you kill, we take a Taliban commander or an activist out and we shoot him in the back of the head. You drop a drone on a village and you kill the commander, and yes, maybe some of his men, and 20 or 30 women and children, who are around. Once again, how dare you make these criticisms of us? I mean, any notion that this gains, any sort of resonance outside a tiny proportion of the Pakistani intelligentsia, who basically are anti-military in principle, is completely mistaken. Isn't Webb a former soldier himself? Yes. Yeah, you'd have thought, I mean, wasn't Webb in Vietnam?
He was.
Well, please, Anyway, thank you all very much.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.